Hello and welcome to Staffordshire University School of Law, Policing and Forensics. My name is Rachel Stretch and I am one of the lecturers here, and I'm pleased to be able to talk to you today about family law. Now, the law is something which is very traditional and it has a lot of history, but it is also something that does sometimes change and develop as society changes and develops. And I think one way this can be seen is how family law and the idea of what relationships are recognised by family law has changed and developed. You have here what is the traditional definition of what marriage is, and you'll see it's the voluntary union for life of one man and one woman to the exclusion of all others. Now, looking at that, you may think that some of that is still true, but you may think that some of it has changed and it's no longer an accurate reflection of what marriage is or what relationships are recognised by the law. So that case was from 1866. That's a long, long time ago, and a lot of things have changed in society since then. So do you think that definition is still true, or do you think it should still be true? What bits of it do you think are still valid? And what bits do you think have either definitely changed or do you think should be changed? One of the things we do when we study law is we don't just learn what the law is, but we also think about why it's that way. And we think about how well it's working and how fair it is and how it might need to be changed. So one of the things we do in law is we do think critically about the law. Now, one of the things on that slide was the idea that marriage was a union between a man and a woman. The woman pictured on this slide is a woman called Elizabeth Bellinger. And in the early 2000s, Elizabeth Bellinger went to court so the court could declare that her marriage was a valid marriage. She had been married for about 20 years. When Elizabeth Bellinger was born, she was assigned gender as a boy, and she grew up as a boy, but she later realised that she was in fact a woman and lived the rest of her life as a woman. Her husband knew about her history. They were happily married, but they wanted a declaration from the court that their marriage was valid. The court, and Elizabeth Bellinger actually took it to the highest court in the land, were very sympathetic to her and her husband. But at that time, marriage had to be between a man and a woman. And at that time, you were defined by the gender you were born. So someone like Elizabeth Bellinger, who'd been born a boy, was defined as a male, even though she grew up her life as a woman. Now, the law has changed, and that is no longer the case. And her case now would be decided very, very differently. Another thing in terms of the union of a man and a woman is how the law responds to relationships between either two men or between two women. At one time, these relationships were illegal. That's no longer the case, but for a long time after that, whilst the relationship wasn't illegal, it wasn't possible for two men or two women to formally recognise their relationship or to get any rights from being married to each other. That changed in the early 2000s when something called civil partnerships were introduced. Now, obviously, some of you listening to this may know people who have these sorts of relationships or may be in these sorts of relationships yourselves. And a civil partnership is something that's a bit like a wedding, a bit like a marriage, but without the religious implications and without the ceremony. Okay, but then later in 2015, it was possible for 2 men or 2 women to actually get married. Last year, in a way, things came full circle because I said earlier that civil partnerships were a bit like a wedding, a marriage without the tradition and without the ceremony and without the religious implications, which is very much an oversimplification, but it's basically what it is. And some straight couples felt, well, actually, we want the commitment of a marriage, but we don't want all the baggage and history that comes around with it. So last year it was made possible for a man and a woman to not only get married, but to, if they preferred, choose to have a civil partnership. One of the things on the slide was the idea that marriage should be a voluntary union, that nobody should be coerced into marriage or forced to marry somebody. Now, this is still something that is true, and it's something that hopefully is uncontroversial. What's more difficult is how society responds to forced marriage. Now, obviously, if someone's been forced into marriage, that marriage isn't valid. They're not going to be held to it. And obviously, if somebody's been forced into marriage, there should be protection for them and things to stop that happening. What's more difficult to decide is what we should do with people who force people to marry. Should it be a criminal offence? Now, some of you listening to this will think, well, of course it should, because it's such an awful thing that it should have a really high sanction to deter people from doing that. And that is a very, very valid view, and it's actually the view that is taken in this country. But there are difficulties with doing that. If you criminalise forced marriage, it often means that somebody who's been in a forced marriage is going to be sending their wider family to prison if they report it. And this may be a deterrent to them reporting it. So when we think about how the law works, we think not only about what seems morally right, as important as that is, and it is very, very important, but we also sometimes think about how effective things are and how they actually work and what will be the most pragmatic solution. Our final thing on the original quote that we had was that marriage was for life. And many of you listening to this will know very well that that's not actually the case. It is possible to get divorced. And in fact, the law on divorce is something that's being reformed and changed at the moment. But this brings us on to another question. Should it be harder to get married? Should it be harder to get divorced? Should you be able to just walk away whenever you feel like it? Or should there be steps that a person has to go through because marriage is seen as a commitment? Alternatively, some of you may think, well, actually, it shouldn't be harder to get divorced, but it should be harder to get married. So what we've looked at here is we've talked about how law is something that has a lot of history, but does change and develop. And one of the things that you will do if you study law at Staffordshire University is you won't just learn what the law is, but you'll think about and learn the context behind it and think about how it changes and how it is changing. To be a good law student, you have to be used to thinking critically about things and questioning things and wondering why things are the way they are. On our law degree, you won't just gain a lot of knowledge about what the law is, although you will do that. So you won't just gain a lot of facts, but you'll also develop a lot of skills that you'll be able to take with you after you graduate. Thank you very much for listening, and please do visit our website for more information about the degrees we have to offer. Thank you.